Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Episode 37, your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very, very seriously, but not too seriously. The Atlanta Braves won the World Series, and accordingly, Brian gets to come on to the podcast and take his victory lap. I make a mountain out of the molehill that is the beef, as the kids say, the beef between Nikola Jokic and Markieff Morris. And the icing on the cake, the cherry on top of the sundae, one Aaron Rodgers, COVID Inoculator. Without further ado.
Act 1. The Atlanta Braves won the World Series. Brian takes a victory lap.
On again to recap the baseball playoff season and to no doubt celebrate, if not gloat, Brian Hoff, Atlanta Braves fan extraordinaire. Brian, how are you feeling?
Mr. Knackley, it is a beautiful day. It's a sunny day. The sun is shining. The skies are glorious, and the Braves are world champions yet again. It is a wondrous, wondrous time.
Wondrous is actually a great term to use. I am happy for you in the sense that we've been friends for a long time, although rivals because our teams are in the same division. I was happy to see someone that I knew was a diehard, has been a staunch Braves fan for as long as I've known you. I was happy for you that the Braves won, but it is a sad reminder that a team that was below 500 at the All-Star break, which the New York Metropolitans find themselves more years than not, the Atlanta Braves were able to make a couple, as you pointed out, key acquisitions. Actually, not a couple. 4 or 5 key acquisitions. Guys who stepped in immediately boosted the lineup, boosted the bullpen, and lo and behold, this team, they didn't tear it up so much that they were just, like you said, consistent for the back half of the season. And here they are. What, did they win 95 games, 94 games, which is all it took to win the NL East, and they made their run in the playoffs, right?
Yeah, and it was amazing. I mean, if you look back at the 1st of July and you looked at the odds, they had like a 0.8% chance of making the playoffs. Or maybe it was going to the World Series, but a 0.8% chance. Either way, they were, 3 to 4 games behind the Mets, who were, running relatively strong. But as we discussed in prior episodes, the Mets will be the Mets. The Mets stood up yet again. Acuna goes out right at the 1st of July, right before the All-Star break. And Alex Anthopoulos, who did not get GM for the year, Executive of the Year, for some unknown reason, he ends up making probably some of the greatest trade deadline moves to bolster a team that you could ever think of. And if anything, it wasn't the big names. He didn't give up a ton for it. He gave up a cup of coffee for Adam Duvall, who led the league in home runs and RBIs. And was one of the key factors. Made a trade for 4 outfielders. Each one of them had an impact. Made a trade for Rich Rodriguez, a closer for the Pirates, who, even though he was not there at the end, when he came in, the month that he came in, really allowed the Braves bullpen to settle into their roles. Right. And that was key. That was absolutely key. And as they're going through, it's funny. Ron Washington, the elder statesman on the Braves coaching staff, has been around the game forever. He's the guy that's out there at 75, 76 years old, doing ground ball drills with every infielder before every ball game. He made a comment in a team meeting at the beginning of August. He said, listen, man, once we get in front of them, all they're going to see is asses and elbows. And that's what happened. The Braves took hold. They stayed consistent. And it's not just them staying consistent. if you look at the numbers from August 2nd, I believe it is, they had the best record in baseball.
Oh, I was unaware of this.
Of what the Giants did with 105, 106 games, regardless of what the Dodgers did with 105 games, the Braves had the best record in baseball from August 2nd on. That's why they had the wherewithal and the momentum getting into the playoffs. We talked last time about the bullpen and Will Smith in the back end, who had some, you want to talk about Rolaids relief. I mean, there were some times where everybody's screaming for his head because he's just not getting the job done. He goes to he has that game in San Diego we talked about last time where he loads the bases in the ninth inning and then goes on to strike out the side. He was lights out in the playoffs. 6 for 6 in saves. You back that up with the rest of what they call the night shift, between Tyler Matzik, who 5 years ago was out of baseball with the yips.
Yep.
The Braves bring him back. He ends up going lights out. Last year during the shortened season, one of the relievers actually referred to him as the Death Star because he was lights out. He was a big round guy and he was just lights out. And that's what he did. AJ Minter, for all his struggles early on, came in and, he got demoted to AAA. He came in and got it done. He was lights out. Luke Jackson, lights out. The bullpen got it done. And the adversity that the Braves went through the entire thing, even the playoffs, was astounding. So it was a good run. It was an absolutely good run.
What I thought about as the Braves were shutting down these hitters over the course of, in particular, the Dodgers series and then in the World Series against the Astros, two teams that had games where they didn't hit well, and then they would back that up with just monster games. I thought about all of the teams. Remember when the Yankees were the juggernaut, that monolith in the late 90s, and they always had this ability to pick up a guy from another team that was later in his years in his career, right? It was a more experienced player, someone that's not going to warrant that last deal on his career where it's 4 years and $50 million. This is someone who's probably at the twilight of their career. That person would come into the Yankees, whether it's on the mound or whether it's at the plate or whether it's in the field, and they would perform as well as they had ever had in their career. There's just all these different names. Now, granted, the Yankees had that, murderer's row of, Williams, and they had Jeter, and they had Paul O'Neill. And those guys were of course, the stalwarts. But you need all of those role players. You need guys who are going to come in and with a lifetime 279 average hit 341 in the NL or the ALCS, hit 341 in the World Series with 14 at-bats or something like that. And that's exactly what the Braves got. Particularly, they like to call it Jocktober now. Who thought that was going to be such a great move? He was on the scrap heap, right?
Right. And, with Jock was in LA for forever. And he was raised up in LA, and he was that guy. He was that cocky guy that nobody liked unless he was on your team. And, he came in, and he was the first guy that Anthopoulos traded for in July. And when he came in, first thing he said to the locker room is, "You guys are a pretty good effing team." And that was his attitude going in. And what was really great about the Braves overall is, regardless of what happened, regardless of who came in, that locker room never wavered. Right? They all had the same goal. As new guys came in, they were all welcomed in. They had the characters. They had, they had the personalities. They had the leaders throughout the locker room. But Jock came in, lightened it all up. What did he do? He was coming off the bench for a lot of it, right? That didn't change. He wasn't a starter anymore. He was going to platoon. He knew that coming in. But, he'd come in and hit the pinch hit home run in the seventh inning to take a lead randomly, right? And he did that same thing, and he did that through the NLDS. He went a little bit quiet in the NLCS, but he had some huge games in the NLDS, which is one of the reasons the Braves won it. Not to mention the fact that, Freddie Freeman, a lefty, hits a bomb off of Josh Hader, a lefty who hasn't had a home run hit against him, a slider from a left-handed batter in like 2 years. It's just those types of things. And when you get those little pieces that mesh in that perfectly, it's all about chemistry. And if somebody's got everybody else's back, then everything's going to be fine. And, you see Duvall comes in, as we talked last time, the day he found out he was traded, he was on a plane to Atlanta, played that night. He's another one of those guys. Now, he was much more solid, but you look at a Jorge Soler, who a few years ago was the AL home run king. Had a relatively down year last year, was not playing well this year, was starting to come back around again, and Alex Anthopoulos found him. And what did he do? You know what? World Series MVP. Eddie Rosario. He was traded for the Panda. Can't recall his name for right now, but traded from the Panda.
Note, Brian is referring to Francisco Lindor.
And, who was then released 30 seconds later. He's on the IL. He's still on the IL for 3 weeks when he's with the Braves. He comes in, makes some contributions, but then what happens in the playoffs, right? All of a sudden, NLCS. I saw a T-shirt. It's the game that Eddie Rosario played. And, he goes it's 5-16 for the NLCS. He's NLCS MVP. We get to the World Series. Soler has 3 home runs in the World Series. The bomb in the second inning against the Astros in Game 6, which absolutely silenced Minute Maid Park, goes out of the ballpark. He hits 3 home runs for the series. All of a sudden, he's World Series MVP. If you looked at the bulk of the playoffs, you had 2 guys that were more consistent, right? You had Tyler Matzik, who was the 7th inning guy, and then sometimes 7th and 8th inning guys for the Braves throughout the playoffs, who was absolutely lights out, came back from the yips. Braves still have him under control for 2 more years. And Freddie Freeman. Freddie Freeman had 5 home runs during the series or during the playoffs. But somebody always outshined him in some way, shape, or form. It was Jock in the NLDS, it was Rosario in the NLCS, and it was Soler in the World Series. But when it all came down to it, it was one solid team that got this job done and got it done from, let's call it, August 1st to early November.
Right. I actually want to introduce 2 things to you. I'm going to ask you 2 questions. The first being, have you seen the comments that were made today by Scott Boras with relation to the Braves in the World Series?
Briefly. I saw a headline and the fact that it was the dumbest comment ever made.
Right. So I want to talk about this very, very quickly to any of the listeners that are actually still listening, and to any of them that have not read, as of November 10th, an article where Scott Boras made comments about the Braves in the World Series. Boras's conceit, if you will, was that the Braves only won the World Series because all of these other teams in Major League Baseball are conspiring to keep contracts down, and that they're all tanking. And that's how the Braves were able to pick up so many assets. One of the reasons why I found this to be such a stupid comment, now granted, you're dealing with Scott Boras, for anybody, again, who's still listening and is not familiar with baseball. This is an agent. He's not a manager. He's not an owner. Scott Boras is a player's agent, so he's always going to be posturing for increased salaries for his clients. That's obviously good for him because he's taking a percentage of the amount of money that he can get for them. But Boras's comments here are especially stupid because you have just outlined very quickly in 6 minutes a number of the players that were on that Braves team that had their moment in the sun and then fell off the face of the earth. I mean, one of the reasons why the Braves were able to pick up so many of these players that had such a illustrious past is because it was in the past. They were not playing at that level, and to the extent that any of them had played at that level, it was years prior. So your thoughts on Scott Boras saying, look, the reason why the Braves won the World Series is because the other teams were tanking.
Yeah, and the phrase that I saw was competitive cancer in baseball. Baseball's is a victim of a competitive cancer caused by teams unloading veterans to accumulate draft picks. And the Braves title was a direct result of this tanking, which is it absolutely is the dumbest thing that I've ever seen. You're absolutely right. The reason that it's in the past is it's in the past, right? These guys were not playing that well this year. Now, part of it was Cleveland. Cleveland was getting rid of Rosario's contract. He was hurt, but he wasn't playing well that early in the season. So Lair had fallen off, was coming back a little bit, but he was a home run king, and then faltered. But he had a little bit of a sign here and there. Jock was not given a contract by the Dodgers, which is why he signed a 1-year deal. And you know what? And it all played out, but that wasn't the main reason. The main reason was every one of those players who had success in the past came in to an organization and a clubhouse that was so tightly knit, that was so positive, that was so loose, that it allowed them to play the games that they used to play. It allowed them to play their game. And that's the reason that they won. It's not – listen, the reason this is the dumbest comment, I mean, look at the Dodgers. The Dodgers have $250,000 payroll.
Exactly.
$250,000 payroll and didn't win it. The Yankees, the Red Sox, all of these major payrolls, and they didn't win it. What wins it? It wins it is smarts, right? It is a team that has this cohesion. It's a team and a coaching staff and management staff that knows what they're doing. We talked about this. You look at the World Series or NLCS. Brian Snitker, and not just the NLCS, let's go to the entire playoffs. Brian Snitker outmanaged each one of his opposing managers throughout the playoffs.
Agreed.
You and I talked about Craig Counsell. He outmanaged Craig Counsell, not to mention the fact that Jock was a rock star. Freddie hits an absolute bomb against Josh Hader. He absolutely outmanaged Dave Roberts, 100%. There were moves that Dave Roberts was making throughout that NLCS. I'm like, what are you doing? He's got a starter that's going to start in 2 days, and he throws him in to pitch a strong relief inning in a high pressure situation, high stress situation. The decisions he was making were not smart. And you and I talked about this, and I made this comment last time. If you want to win in baseball, you have to have the perfect mix of analytics and baseball gut, right? The Tampa Bay Rays, they're smarter than you. They have the analytics down, but they tend to lean on the analytics way too much. If you looked at the analytics strictly throughout these playoffs, the Braves don't win. It was the improbable win. There's no reason that team should have won the World Series if you look at it on paper.
Right.
It just shouldn't. But all of these factors, you get Ian Anderson, who's pitching in the NLCS, and he's a rookie stud pitcher, but he's having a bad day. And he gets pulled after 75 pitches in 3 or 4 innings. Why? Well, Bobby saw it. He's not Bobby, Bobby Cox. Snitker saw it. He just didn't have it that day. And, let's make sure we've got him available, if we need him again at Game 7. So much of it is the direct combination of analytics and where the game is today and baseball gut. And if you don't have either one of those, you're not gonna make it. It's not that teams are tanking, Mr. Boras. It's the fact that there's a team that had the chemistry, a general manager that saw the opportunities, because all of those plays could not have turned out, right? Each one of those trades could have been busts. They all had the makings of them. None of them were blockbusters. I like the Duvall trade strictly because it was Duvall, and when Jocktober was picked up, I'm like, yeah, I'll take Jock. We need left field, but nothing was a blockbuster. That's why they won it. They saw the opportunity. They had the team chemistry. They had the management staff. I mean, if you look at the Braves bench between Brian Snitker, who's obviously been in the Braves organization for 45 years, he's all he's ever known. You look at Ron Washington, who has been a manager. These guys know what they're doing. They absolutely know what they're doing, and that's what gets done. I think the Boris comment is just, dare I say, dumb as owl shit, and it just goes to show how self-serving he is.
Well, I also want to throw in, as far as that comment goes, the man is a genius when it comes to posturing, and so I think he's actually posturing in a way for the upcoming collective bargaining conflict. And I really don't want to focus on that now. This is more your platform to gloat, and I'm going to give you as much, because the next thing I wanted to address with you is, look at the Braves. You're going to have Acuna coming back. You're going to have all of these assets. Many of them have been in the doldrums. They've been in the dumps. They've been in AAA. They've been out of baseball. You've got this team coming back where the chemistry seems very, very tight. What are the Braves' prospects for next season?
It's a great question. I think the biggest question that I keep checking on at least twice a day is what's going to happen with Freddie Freeman. This is a contract that should have been extended prior to the season, if not, before the All-Star break. But, we go through a World Series and into the championship parade, and Freddie doesn't have a contract. Dansby Swanson, when he was on the podium at the celebration, he says, the Braves have been waiting for this for 26 years. Well, Dansby Swanson grew up 7 miles, if that, away from the stadium in Marietta, Georgia. He said, listen, man, I've been waiting 26 years for this too. He said, the second thing I'm going to say, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for it, is re-sign Freddie. And he dropped the mic, and that was it. And the crowd goes in a roar. But they've got to first and foremost get Freddie taken care of. They made a couple of moves. Obviously, they had the wherewithal with the crowds coming back this year to be able to make those moves at the trade deadline, and they did that for only $10 million. Like, the total spend at the trade deadline was only $10 million. But they had the ability to re-sign a Charlie Morton for $20 million. They had the ability to re-sign or extend Travis d'Arnaud for another 2 years at catcher. Now, after 2 years, the Braves won't need him, and Travis will probably be ready, if not to hang him up, to go DH somewhere. But the Braves have a catcher coming up that's going to be lights out. But the number one thing that they've got to do is re-sign Freddie. And I don't think you sign d'Arnaud to an extension. I don't think you sign Charlie Morton to a 20-year deal if you don't have Freddie at the top of your mind. It's crazy posturing on both sides, to use that term again. Everybody's saying the right things. Alex Pantopolis saying, listen, he's a Hall of Famer in my eyes. We want Freddie. We want Freddie to be here. We want Freddie to be here a long time. Freddie wants to be here. And Freddie says, listen, you know where my heart is. I want to be here. They've just got to get the deal done. It's a matter of what the numbers look like. And, they only have a certain amount of time to negotiate with him before he goes on the open market.
Okay, I want to transition, although it's nice staying in this vibration of positivity, the Braves being the St. Louis Blues of baseball, the Blues being at the All-Star break in the NHL a few seasons ago, a below 500. Hell, I think they were in last place in their division. They go and win the Stanley Cup.
Exactly.
We need to now decrease our vibration. We need to get into a more low frequency. We need to talk about the fact that the New York Metropolitans can't seem to get their heads out of their hind end. They could not have pulled off, in their current state, such a feat as the Atlanta Braves did, because they still do not have a general manager. they have reached out to many a top flight baseball mind, people who you would think with the budget that this team has in the market that this team plays would be interested. They cannot find anyone to join LOLMets. Your thoughts?
It's a comedy show. It's a high comedy show. With as much as Mr. Steven wants everything to be okay, and the Mets are going to be the Mets, and everything's going to be great from a positive standpoint. They can't get out of their own way. I'm looking at a list of 11 candidates that turned it down. Theo Epstein, Billy Beane, David Stearns, the Brewers president of baseball operations, San Francisco Giants general manager, assistant GMs from the Yankees, assistant GMs from the Red Sox. Everyone has turned them down. Sandy Alderson comes out and says, well, the reason they turned it down is because they just can't handle, they're not ready for the New York landscape and can't handle the New York environment. First and foremost, Theo can handle any environment.
Agreed.
He turned around two 0 for organizations into World Series champions. You got, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken, I heard this is David Stearns, the president of baseball operations for the Milwaukee Brewers, grew up in Manhattan.
Yes, this is correct.
The Yankees head of Gene Afterman, assistant GM for the Yankees, she's in the Bronx. She knows New York. These are not the reasons that nobody wants to come work for you. Nobody wants to come work for you is because the organization overall is an absolute mess. It has been for a while. And you saw that when the players are booing the fans last year. It's an absolute mess. Something's got to be done. And if anything, Bowen's just got to clean house. Alderson's got to go. Because the only common denominator through all of this from a management perspective is Sandy Alderson.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I agree. I actually, and it's curious, I talked about this in the first 3 episodes of my podcast, just how peculiar it is that I have an affinity for these teams that seem so akin to one another. But this is very similar to the University of Tennessee football coaching situation that's gone on for the last 6-7 years, where it is public, it is known that you are reaching out to not only the hot candidates, the candidates that you think would be interested in a high-profile job, but because of all the rejections, it becomes known that these secondary and these tertiary candidates also don't want to touch the job with the 10-foot pole. People that you, as an organization and your fans, think are beneath the position in the first place. The market is telling you, no, not only are these people not beneath the position, you aren't what you think you are. That's where I think the New York Metropolitans are. It's where the University of Tennessee football team has been for the course of the last decade. It's a sad commentary where you can't go out and give someone an open checkbook and say, come and fix this and work for me and have them do it. Right?
Absolutely. It's just not that simple anymore. And, as you look at this, if anybody has the money, the Mets do. The Mets have the money, right? They've got the big TV contract. They've got the owner with deep pockets. They've got the money to do it. And the money is still not bringing them in. So if you can't get the top 11 candidates in Major League Baseball to even interview for your open position, with the wallet that would be open, with the challenge that it would be, right? Think of Theo Epstein, the challenge that it would be. Imagine bringing the Mets a World Series. He did it to Chicago. He did it to the Red Sox. It's a challenge for him. He doesn't want it. He won't deal with it. The culture's a mess.
Yes. And
it's not going to get any better.
Right. I think this would be a situation where the only way you'd be able to entice, to solicit someone like a Theo Epstein is in the overture. You basically tell this person, look, I'm giving you full reign. You have complete and total control over this organization, even insofar as you could censor me. You could censor me, the owner. This is how Cohen is going to have to approach the marketplace, because I think a lot of people saw, and you made fun of this, and rightfully so, that he's not nearly the baseball mind that he thinks he is. And as an owner, you can't come in like a fantasy player and make comments about how things should be working or about how things do work and throw tantrums when your fantasy is not realized in real life. It is a very troubling circumstance, because Cohen's not going anywhere, and no one's going to be worse in my mind than the Wilpons. I'm going to give Cohen the benefit of the doubt only because there's a learning curve here, and he may take 3 or 4 seasons before he really understands what he needs to be, what he needs to do, what kind of space he needs to create for the Mets to be successful. But in the short term, for a team that has a $200 million payroll, I mean, to actually go to our last point when we were talking about Boris and his nonsensical input, to speak to a team that has a $200 million payroll that absolutely fell apart in the last 45 days of the season, and to have an owner that doesn't seem to have any wherewithal when it comes to the owning of a baseball team, it doesn't look good for the Mets for another 5 seasons. Yes, they've got the talent on the field, but my God, they seem to have every single page in the book of how to ruin a baseball team. They've written those pages in the book. There's a movie about it. They're going to have the theme song. I don't know when it ends, Brian. I just don't know when it ends. The only hope
first off, that theme song I think is the clown theme, right?
Yes.
And Steve Cohen has as much influence over his players as I do over my fantasy football team, right? And the players therein, to reference your fantasy camp. But you're absolutely right. And with the Theo Epstein comment, I agree with you. The only way to do that is to give absolute control and possibly even censorship. But if that were to happen, who's gone? Sandy Alderson. Like that to me is the key to turning everything around, or at least attempting to turn everything around. Because as long as he's still there, it seems like it's always going to be the same story. How many GMs have they gone through? How many managers have they gone through? How many managers are they going to go through? The unfortunate part is all those phenomenal pieces they have, including Jacob deGrom, will all be gone in 5 years.
Right, and that's the sad part here, is that the talent that they have right now, it's going to be gone by the time, I think, ownership makes the right movement. And I can't agree more. Alderson's got to go. In fact, as you've already stated in this very podcast, why you're not cleaning house right now, I have no idea. There isn't any of that infrastructure that you need to salvage. What you need to try to do is salvage the careers of the players, the all-stars that you have on this team now, and see if you can't turn this thing into a viable winner in the next, 24 to 36 months. So, Brian, I appreciate you, as always, coming on the podcast. And, hey, seriously, even though it is a rival team, congratulations. Any kind of worst to first story is always going to be appreciated by this podcaster. And I will give you one last chance to gloat.
Well, Patrick, I will leave you with this. The tomahawk chop is alive and well, ladies and gentlemen. The Braves are world champions. All is right in the world. Mr. Ackley, have a great evening. Always a pleasure talking to you, my friend. We'll talk to you soon.
Act 2, Jokic got it right.
The NBA on TNT is probably the best sports-related show that's ever existed. It's not so much that these guys, Charles Barkley, Kenny Smith, Shaquille O'Neal, they all have personality. They all are willing to express their opinions. But these athletes, people who played at a high level, people who were all-stars, people who won championships in the NBA, they often have what are the most reasonable opinions, what are the most rational opinions about not only issues surrounding sports, surrounding basketball, but surrounding all sorts of different social and political issues. This was most recently verified in the brouhaha between Nikola Jokic and Markieff Morris. Now, if you are not an NBA fan and you are not aware of what happened, just go on to your local Google machine or YouTube, and you can type in simply Jokic, Jokic, and Morris, Markieff Morris. What happened between Markieff Morris and Nikola Jokic? It's close to the end of the game between the Denver Nuggets and the Miami Heat. Jokic is the center for the Denver Nuggets, and Morris is a power forward, if not center, for the Miami Heat. In the waning minutes of the basketball game, it appears that he's going to make an outlet pass or even shoot the ball from half court, and Morris runs right into him, fouls him extremely hard, almost knocks him down. Does not make a play on the basketball. For his part, Morris then casually turns his back and walks away. Jokic gathers himself and then storms over, runs directly into Morris, lays a shoulder into him, and knocks him to the floor. Both players ejected. Now, the Twitterverse, the sports punditry, the wokesters come out in support of one Markieff Morris. And this is a very, very interesting take on this interaction between the two players. The tone of the opinion presents to me as, although Morris may have done something wrong, in the totality of circumstances, it was Jokic that was the aggressor, because Jokic should not have approached Morris while his back was turned. That the crime of the century in sport or in any other circumstances, you don't hit someone while their back is turned. This simplistic, this binary, this academic criticism of what happened is one of the interesting issues in how our society is evolving and how we evaluate conflict. As someone who likes to reflect on history, this is a circumstance where I believe society is changing. The social norms, the way we look at things socially, from a group dynamic. This is where things are actually changing. I don't believe we're now coming to an understanding of how people thought, which was consistent with the way they thought in the 20s or the 50s or the 70s. This assessment on conflict is something that I believe is developing. It is new. And I think it spans much more than a sports perspective. I need not provide much of a criticism of the criticism, much of an opinion on these opinions, because it was beautifully summed up by one Shaquille O'Neal and one Charles Barkley and one Kenny Smith as to why what Jokic did was not only warranted, but was appropriate. O'Neal, Barkley said it best. If you hit me, don't turn your back. Again, if you hit me, don't turn your back. You hit me, we're swinging. You don't hit me and then turn your back and expect me to then be bound by some sort of social norm that I can't hit someone in the back because you have A, elected to instigate the conflict, and then B, you can actually govern the parameters of my response by simply turning around? Bullshit. You hit me, we're swinging. You hit me, we're in a fight. You don't turn your back after starting a fight. Strangely, this is no longer how people see the nature of conflict. And I do believe it speaks to something that is more devious, that is more detrimental, that is uglier about the way people are developing their sense of social norms, their sense of a social contract. I can lash out. I can hit you. I can start something, and then I can create the parameters of how you get to respond to the something that I started, to the conflict. It is the most self-centered, narcissistic, delusional approach to how conflict is started and conflict is resolved. Sadly, what this really speaks to out in the Twitterverse, out in this sports punditry, this sports criticism, this sports media landscape, it speaks to projection. These people who are commenting, who are criticizing, who are critiquing Jokic, they are projecting. These are the types of people that want to be able to start a fight and then be able to govern how you fight that fight. They want to be able to start a fight and then have you have to tie one of your hands behind your back so that the outcome for them is certain. They can't help but reveal to you in this projection their own selfishness, their own narcissism, their own delusion. Charles Barkley, Kenny Smith, Shaquille O'Neal summed it up. My point to you, dear listener, is think about the way people are now looking at conflict, that they have the power, the authority, the wherewithal, that they can start conflict and that then they can govern your response to that conflict, that the parameters of how it is addressed is also within their power dynamic. When I was younger, when many of you were younger, one of the ways you were dissuaded from fighting, from starting a fight, was that once the fight was started, you can't control how that fight is escalated. You get into a fight, sure, it can be a bunch of wrestling and red faces, and then you're basically waiting for people to break it up, but that is not a certainty. If you start a fight, you don't know that you may not be getting into a situation where the other person isn't going to stop until they hurt you. And certainly, you would never be able to start a fight in the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s, and then turn your back on the person that you started the fight with and have any expectation that you would be able to govern that person's response by a simple, you can't hit me in the back. You start a fight, you've got to stand face to face with the person that you started the fight with. You instigate the conflict, you've got to deal with the consequences. The managing, the dealing with consequences. We all want to be able to instigate conflict and then be able to do what? To absolve ourselves of any of the consequences. Yeah, well, I lashed out in anger. I said something I shouldn't have. I did something that I shouldn't have. But I got over it pretty quickly. I turned my back. Therefore, it's over. The conflict starts when I say it starts because I take the action consistent with initiating the conflict, and the conflict ends when I say it ends because I take actions consistent with the conflict ending. What could be more selfish? What could be more narcissistic? You decide, you elect to create conflict. You want to start a fight. Don't turn your back. And to the extent that we've become a society that will allow, that will protect such selfishness, such narcissistic behavior, that, dear listener, that's where the country is falling apart. It isn't in the retaliation. It isn't in someone hitting you in the back. It's that we are electing to start conflict, and we fully expect that we can also elect how that person responds to the conflict that we've created. That the other person, that the other people have to abide by the parameters that we create for a response. It's the mind of a child. It's the minds of children. This is how irresponsible children address problems. I can lash out. I can hurt you. Then I can turn my back and I can dictate to you the parameters by which you respond to my action. Thankfully, there are voices out there that see as much and that have a high public profile so that we don't forget. You want to start a fight, you've got to finish a fight. Turning your back isn't a noble act, it's an act of cowardice.
Act 3. Aaron Rodgers, COVID Inoculator.
I'm trying, dear listener. I'm trying to be less of a judgmental prick. It's part of the spiritual journey that I'm on, my spiritual growth. But as many of you who know me personally can attest to, I have found that Aaron Rodgers was a douche, and I have professed as much for close to 15 years. The way he's treated individual teammates, the fact that it's never his fault that the Packers have failed routinely to go beyond the NFC Championship game to actually make the Super Bowl. The strange beef that he has with his own family. As many of you are probably familiar, but maybe you aren't, he has completely excommunicated every member of his family. He does not speak to any of them. He's a very temperamental, testy little douche. I cannot deny the fact that when the man throws the football, generally he throws it in the direction of his own teammates and they catch it and they are able to successfully traverse down the field. But, like his predecessor, Brett Favre, this is not the case in the playoffs, and particularly in championship games. Earlier this year, as many of you know, when answering a question as to whether or not he had received the vaccine for COVID, Rodgers replied that he was inoculated. It was among and consistent with many of the douchey things that he has said in the past. I did not personally find it troubling whatsoever because I put it in a category of douchey. He says douchey things, he does douchey things. So when it turns out that Aaron Rodgers had not received the COVID vaccine and had broken many COVID protocols set by the NFL and agreed to by the NFL Players Association, I shrugged my shoulders. Pretty consistent. And doesn't offend me whatsoever. I don't worship at the altar of douche. I'm not particularly concerned one way or the other about what any douche does or does not do. Some listeners have reached out to me inquiring about my thoughts, my opinions specific to this Aaron Rodgers situation, to the fact that he didn't get the COVID vaccine. He made what was a douchey comment in response to a direct question about whether or not he had received the COVID vaccine. And now he's sitting out a game because he didn't receive the vaccine. He got COVID, or at least he tested positive for COVID. And based on the league protocols, he has to sit out for a minimum of 10 days. He cannot test again. And if he receives 2 negative tests in 24 hours, be cleared to play. If you don't take the vaccine, you have to sit out 10 days after having received a positive test. In the midst of what I will call this fake controversy, Rodgers came out on the Pat McAfee podcast and made a number of statements specific to what he had represented in the past, why he had done what he had done, his beliefs surrounding COVID and the vaccine, and the social media mob that is for and against the vaccine. Additional listener inquiries arose. What do you think about that? What do you think about his position? What do you think about the way he handled this whole situation? Here's what I think. I think this is all a blessing in disguise. Looking at things now from a different perspective, a different lens, I feel like this is all a blessing in disguise. And what do I mean by that? The removal of those goddamn awful State Farm commercials. If I never see another State Farm commercial with Aaron Rodgers in it, I'll be a happy, contented, balanced individual. This commercial with Aaron Rodgers, where he's got the acoustic guitar, they're in some kind of art house environment, and he's disappointed that he's not exclusively getting the Rodgers rate, and so he has to sing this emotional, heartfelt disappointment song. You're telling me that this isn't some sort of paradox? This isn't some sort of projection? This is his douchiness in its full peacock, in its full display. I have that much more, that 30 seconds every 10 to 12 minutes. I have that much more sanity per viewing of an NFL broadcast. And that may be all I need, dear listener, to make the difference that I was sent to this planet to make. Thank you, universe. We are working in accord. We have all, in a way, been inoculated from this prolific tomfoolery that is these Aaron Rodgers State Farm commercials. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.